Well, Happy New Year. I did not quite get to these last two videos the way I had hoped. It was a blast at Christmas time when I went down to Texas to visit my family, and we just went 90 miles an hour and never stopped until I got back here and crashed in my bed. So I'm going to try to do these now. 36 is very short and fairly simple. But 35 is not. 35, actually, you can see up at the top of my screen all of the passages I have open. There's a lot to talk about here. And so I wanted to do this justice and to really understand and get into what's going on here. And of course, you can see we're going to look back at Genesis, back at some passages we've already talked about in Numbers, but we're also going to be looking forward to a couple of passages we haven't covered yet, in order to get an explanation out of some of this, because some of it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down into an introduction, so I'm going to go ahead and get started, and then we'll reach these things when we get to them. Numbers chapter 35 and verse 1. And Jehovah spake unto Moses in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. So God is speaking to Moses. This is at the end of their wandering. They're getting ready to go into the land of promise. They're going to cross the Jordan River. Jericho is their first official conquest in the promised land, even though we know that several of the tribes are going to kind of hang out on this side, and that's where they wanted their land. And so this is where God is speaking to Moses. Moses is kind of finishing up the book of Numbers that he's been working on. I also think he takes this time, maybe a few months or something, to write the book of Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy, the way it's worded, is kind of to a more mature nation. They're not just the basics and simple like what we see in the book of Leviticus, which I think was probably the first of the books written. So anyway, God says to him in verse 2, Command the children of Israel that they give unto the Levites of the inheritance of their possession cities to dwell in, and you shall give also unto the Levites suburbs for the cities round about them. So remember, the Levites were not going to get an inheritance. And part of this goes back to Genesis chapter 49. Simeon and Levi, the men who were the actual sons of Jacob, remember Dinah had been seduced by the prince of Shechem. And Simeon and Levi went in and told him that, well, if you want our sister, you have to be circumcised. All the men of your city has to be circumcised. And this prince was like, okay. And so all the men got circumcised. And while they were in so much pain, Simeon and Levi went in and killed everyone. And on top of that, they, I believe they hamstrung the oxen so that they were, the animals even, were damaged and were no longer good for beasts of burden. And it was just awful, very violent and cruel what they did. And Jacob was aghast about it, and God did not seem to approve of what had happened, even though they were defending their sister's honor. So in Genesis 49, in Jacob's parting words, Israel's parting words, he said he's blessing all of his children, telling them what's going to happen to them. And so he says, Simeon and Levi are brethren. Now, this doesn't mean biologically. This means in their in the way that they act. He's associating them in a different way than biologically. Instruments of cruelty are they in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, mine honor be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And so we're seeing that come to pass regarding Levi. Levi does not get an inheritance. Instead, the Levites are going to be scattered throughout the tribes in these cities. Now, God actually turns this into a blessing, because what he ends up doing, the high priest, of course, is going to be in Judah, in the city of Jerusalem, where the tabernacle and later the temple are going to be. And the rest of the Levites are scattered throughout the tribes, and they have to give up a certain number of their cities to the Levites based on how big their tribe is. And of course, we've had that numbering in Numbers 26, and it's an echo, if not a complete and total mirror of Numbers chapter 2 before they sent the spies in. And we're going to talk about those numbers here in just a minute. But the Levites were given these cities to live in as a possession because they had cattle, they had property, they had to live somewhere. And so God takes care of them by giving these cities throughout the tribes. And so Levi is scattered throughout the tribes. He does not have his own portion, just the way that Jacob talked about in Genesis 49. So anyway, God says, give these cities to the Levites, and the cities shall they have to dwell in, and in the suburbs of them shall be for their cattle, and for their goods, and for all their beasts. Remember when the men of war came back, they brought all of the things that they had plundered from the Moabites and the Midianites, the northern Midianites, and they had to give a portion of it. It was cut into two pieces, and 1/50 of whatever the men of war were receiving, they gave to the Levites, and then, 1 out of 500 was given to them, and then 1 out of 50 from whatever's given to those who didn't go to war. And so the Levites got a lot of stuff, and they needed places to put all of these cattle, all these beasts, all their possessions, and that's where these cities come in. And so it says, in the suburbs of the cities which you shall give unto the Levites shall reach from the wall of the city outward 1,000 cubits round about. So from the wall extending out 1,000 cubits. Remember, a cubit is from fingertip to elbow tip, and that's where you're gonna. It's basically 1.5 feet. And so they were going to get about 1,500 feet from the wall. And then I was confused momentarily when I read verse 5, because it says 2,000 cubits, but then I'm like, okay, it's a square, and so you're going to have 1,000 on each side, and that cleared it up for me. So it says in verse 4, in the suburbs of the city which you shall give unto the Levites shall reach from the wall of the city and outward 1,000 cubits round about. And you shall measure from without the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, and on the south side 2,000 cubits, and on the west side 2,000 cubits, and on the north side 2,000 cubits, and the city shall be in the midst, and this shall be to them the suburbs of the city. So think about it. You're going to go. You're going to create these quadrants that are essentially squares. So it's 1,000 by 1,000, and you're going to have. That's where the 2,000 comes in. But it's going to be the radius, or the way that it sticks out from the wall is just 1,000 cubits. So we have to deal with distance versus area here when reading this text. And among the cities which you shall give unto the Levites, there shall be 6 cities for refuge, and we're going to talk more about that later in the chapter. But you're going to give these 6 cities for refuge, which you shall appoint for the manslayer, that he may flee thither, and to them you shall add 42 cities. So the total number of cities is going to be 48 cities. And when I read through this, I was thinking, well, that's nice. Okay, so 6 is a factor of 12. So you're going to have, I guess, those 6 cities split up between every other tribe or something, and then the total is 48 cities. Well, that's a multiple of 12. So I'm guessing that all the tribes are going to give 4 cities up. No, that is not how God does it. And what echoed in my mind as I was reading through this was the parable of the talents, that God gives a lot of talent to one man, and then later gives him a lot of responsibility, commensurate with what responsibility he had early on. And then another man is given 3 talents, or 2 talents, depending on which version you read, and then he's given some responsibility, and then one man is given 1 talent, he hides it and doesn't get any responsibility. And so that kind of echoed in my mind here with just the idea of God giving a lot to those who had a lot and giving a little to those who had a little, basically talking about the idea of God giving us what we can handle. And that's the lesson that I see in this. This is kind of the physical version of that. If you gave everybody the same amount of land, kind of a communist idea, let's divide it up equally between the tribes, well, then you're either going to have the biggest tribes being squished in and not having enough land for everything, Or are you going to have some smaller tribes who have so much land they can't do anything with it? It's just going to be a lot of emptiness with nothing to nobody to work it, nobody to do anything with the land. And so God divides it up based on the numbers of the tribes. And the book of Numbers, of course, is dealing with that. And so he gives them what they can handle. And it's going to be a total of 48 cities. And there's some interesting things that happen here. And I'm going to read through verse 8, and then I'm going to talk about Simeon, because that's an interesting story in and of itself. So verse 7, so all the cities which you shall give to the Levites shall be 48 cities. Them shall you give with their suburbs. And the cities which you shall give shall be of the possession of the children of Israel. So they're going to take it away from the children of Israel. They have to give it up. It's kind of like an offering. From them that have many you shall give many, but from them that have few you shall give few. Every one shall give his cities unto the Levites according to his inheritance which he inheriteth. And so there are places where we read about these cities being established. Deuteronomy 33 is one of those, and when you read through the blessing here that Moses gives right before he dies, Simeon is not mentioned. Simeon doesn't give any cities. And again in Joshua 19, when we read of Simeon here and the blessing, Simeon isn't even given really much of a land promise, so much as he's given some cities himself. So Simeon doesn't actually have a region where Simeon dwells. Simeon is only given a few cities here in Joshua 19, and that goes back to this curse here in Genesis 49, where I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That's exactly what happened. Simeon was scattered within the borders of Judah and only had a few cities to deal with, and they didn't give any of those into the cities that were spread about. Now, you can dig a little bit further, and I've created an Excel spreadsheet here real quick, and you can find out not only where those cities were and who donated them and how many cities from each tribe were donated, but also how the sons of Levi were divided up. And it's very interesting to note how those get divided up. So I divided it up based on the different divisions here that are made in the book of Numbers. There's the sons of Aaron, who are actually the priests. And then there were the Gershonites. Remember, they had their tribe. Their when they were encamped, they had the Gershonites, the Kohathites, and the Merarites were divided up north, south, and west of the camp of the tabernacle. And then you had on the east side were the actual descendants of Aaron and the priest. Well, the sons of Aaron, the priests themselves, only had cities in Benjamin and Judah. And remember, this is well before the division of the kingdoms. There's no kings yet. David hasn't been born. Saul hasn't even been born. Joshua is about to he's the one that's kind of dividing all this up. And then you've got a period of 300 something years of judges. This all happens well before all of that, before there's a division of the kingdom. But Benjamin and Judah get the Aaronites, the descendants of Aaron, from which the priests come. Well, when the kingdom did divide, who was in the southern kingdom that carried on the blessing and eventually brought Messiah into the world? It's Judah and Benjamin. Well, that struck me as super powerful. And then when you look, Asher, you can see based on their numbers. If you go look at Numbers 26 and you see their new numbers as they come out of that wandering in the wilderness, Judah is a big tribe and has a lot of cities here. And then Benjamin, only 4 cities. Asher, only 4 cities. Issachar, only 4 cities. Manasseh only has 2 that they give up. Naphtali gives up 3. Dan gives up 4. Ephraim gives up 4. Now Ephraim and Manasseh are of Joseph, so Joseph altogether gives up 6. And then you have another 2 from Manasseh, but remember, half of Manasseh is on the one side of the Jordan, and half of the Manasseh is on the other side of the Jordan. And so these 2 divisions here, the Gershonites versus the Kohathites, are based on which side of the Jordan they're on. And then Gad does 4, Reuben does 4, and Zebulun does 4. Now, if you notice, I said a lot of these guys do 4. Judah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Wait, did I count that right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. So Judah gets a double portion plus 1. Well, Judah is the one that got the double blessing. He wasn't the oldest son. He was the 4th son of Jacob. But remember, they got passed over. Judah is the one that gets the double blessing, and he's going to be the one that the kings are going to come out of. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. Messiah comes from Judah. There's a lot of blessings here from Judah. Judah gets the Aaronite priesthood. All of this is wrapped up in this land promise that's given to them. Simeon is the cities of Simeon that you read about in Judges 19 are within the land of Judah, in their territory. And so Judah gives this double portion to the Levites because Judah is the biggest land tribe out of all of them. And so not only does it give 4 for itself, but it also gives another 4 representing the double portion, and then plus 1. And I think that's where this idea of Simeon comes along. Now I want to look at Simeon just real quickly. In the book of Numbers, chapter 2, when they first come out of Egypt, Simeon, you can see here's the tribe of Simeon, had 59,300, almost 60,000. Okay, by the time the wandering in the wilderness is done, remember 24,000 men were killed during the Midianite Moabite thing. And so when you get down to them being renumbered in Numbers 26, Simeon only has 22,000. They're almost a third of what they were. They're a little bit larger than a third of what they had been. And so they're very small by the time we get down to the land promise and whatever. And so they end up, oops, I guess I should have turned my phone off. And the Simeonites have a very, very small portion. Now, what happened to Simeon is very, very interesting. In that when the tribes do divide up, Simeon is considered part of the north. And then Levi doesn't really get considered to be part of those 10 northern tribes because remember, Manasseh and Ephraim are part of that. And then you have Simeon, these cities in the land of Judah. You would think that Simeon would end up in the southern tribes with Judah and Benjamin, but they don't. And that's where 2 Chronicles comes in. It's believed, even though it's not exactly stated in Scripture, that the Simeonites, when the division came after Solomon died, between Rehoboam and Jeroboam, that the Simeonites went with the northerners and said, we're going to be part of the 10 northern tribes. But then you have here in 2 Chronicles 8 and 9, it says, when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Oded the prophet, he took courage and put away the abominable idols out of the land of Judah and Benjamin. So that's the land that we're talking about. Out of the cities which he had taken from Mount Ephraim, and renewed the altar of Jehovah that was before the porch of Jehovah. Okay, so this is temple time now. We're actually in the temple, not the tabernacle anymore. And he gathered all Judah and Benjamin, and the strangers, these sojourners, with them out of Ephraim and Manasseh and Simeon. For they fell to him out of Israel. That means they came, these people from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Simeon came from those northern tribes. Not all of them, but a lot of them came from these 3 tribes in great abundance when they saw that Jehovah, his God, Asa's God, was with him. And so what you end up having is you have all of these strangers, these sojourners. Well, what happened to sojourners and strangers throughout the Old Testament? They essentially proselytized and became part of the tribes. Well, what are these people doing? Ephraim and Manasseh and Simeon, these are sojourners. They're displaced people from the 10 northern tribes. And they're not allowed to have their own land because Benjamin and Judah. And so what happens is these sojourners, these strangers, are absorbed into Judah and Benjamin when Asa becomes faithful. It kicks out all the bad stuff, all of the bad religions and stuff, and focuses back on Jehovah God. And so that's what happened to Simeon. It's a very interesting story, but you also end up having an actual fulfillment of this curse that Jacob gives to the descendants of his 2 sons. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and the wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. That's exactly what happened. Simeon goes north and is scattered amongst the 10 northern tribes, and then some of them come back and are kind of dispersed among the Jews, what we call later the Jews. When they go into captivity, they lose their individual tribal identity altogether, and all that's left is Judah and Benjamin and Levi, and the descendants of Aaron as the priesthood. And all that's left of all of these cities at that time, after Assyria comes in and takes out the northern tribes, all that's left are the Aaronite cities, and those who were the actual kin of the priests. So that was also fascinating to me, to see all of this stuff. So that brings us, in terms of Numbers 35, down through verse 8. And so I've got to take a short break. You're gonna see a break in the video, and then I'm gonna come back with verse 9 and finish up. But I've got to get the kids showers and into bed. So bear with me, and I'll be right back. All right, so we are back with Numbers chapter 35, and we're going to begin verse 9 now. I'll make sure I'm recording here. It says, And Jehovah spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you become over Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall appoint you cities to be cities of refuge for you. So these are the 6 cities they've already talked about. That the slayer may flee thither, which killeth any person at unawares. So there's some very specific things that are being spoken of here. Number 1, you have somebody that kills another person. That's the slayer. They kill the person unaware. That is, this is not the same thing as 2 guys that are going at it, fighting each other. These are people that are, we might think of like an Old West shootout where both of them are armed and going at it. This is somebody who has killed another person, and the other person doesn't have a chance. They just could not defend themselves, and they're killed. And so this is a look at what the biblical definition of murder is. And so when you look at the root word is I believe reshach, and it means to kill, and it's a very generic word. So when we go to Exodus 20 and verse 13, and it says thou shalt not kill, it's a very generic idea there. We know from other context, not from the context of Exodus 20 and one of the 10 Commandments, but from other context, that God permits killing. We've seen plenty of it happening up to this point. So just the taking of life is not what is being commanded against, obviously. But what God is against is murder, the taking of a life unjustly. And so these cities were appointed. If you killed somebody, it wasn't in like a fair fight or a face-to-face fight or something along those lines. You killed somebody, you could flee to one of these cities, and then there were it was a place for you to be safe until you could go before the court of law. So let's say you killed a man's brother. Well, that man might pursue you and try to get vengeance for you killing his brother. He might have thought that you murdered his brother. Well, if you flee to one of these cities, you can be safe there until they can bring you before a court of peers or the priests or whatever, and you could be tried and evidence brought and all that kind of stuff. So that's what this is covering here, essentially. Okay, So verse 12, and they shall be unto you cities for refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer die not, until he stand before the congregation in judgment. So this is standing before later what would be the Sanhedrin Council, the Council of Elders, basically a kind of jury and judges here. The high priest would act as judge, and then you'd have the elders or whatever act as the jury. They would examine the evidence. Okay? Verse 13, and these cities which you shall give, 6 cities shall you have for refuge. You shall give 3 cities on this side of Jordan, and 3 cities shall you give in the land of Canaan, which shall be cities of refuge. So this side of Jordan is before they cross over, because remember there were 3 tribes that were like, we like this land. Well, half tribe of Manasseh, but we like this land. We want to stay over here because it looks good for our cattle. And so Moses said, okay, but you got to go in the front of everybody. And they were going to fight until all the land of Canaan was taken, which we see in the book of Joshua. And so there was going to be 3 cities on the side of Jordan that they were on, and then when they got into the land of Canaan, there would be 3 more cities over there, all cities of refuge. And they're roughly equal in geography and about size. It's probably a little bit bigger over on the side of Canaan, but I believe it was Reuben and Gad and half tribe of Manasseh that got over on the east side of Jordan, and they had some pretty big places of land over there. So let's see here. Verse 15, these 6 cities shall be a refuge both for the children of Israel and for the stranger. So anybody who was a sojourner in their land, somebody who was a foreigner, and it says for the stranger and for the sojourner among them. So this law applied to everybody. And that's an interesting thing, is that some of these laws, they were national laws. If anybody broke them, it didn't matter if they were Israelite or not. If anybody broke them, these particular laws were to be applied equally. And so they could all go to these cities of refuge if they knew about them. And it says that everyone that kills any person unawares may flee thither. And so now it's going to define what constitutes murder. If he smite him with an instrument of iron so that he die. So this is probably a sword or a tool or something that's very heavy and can be used as a weapon, even if it isn't originally a weapon. But with an instrument of iron, that's essentially what they're talking about. So we would think like, Professor Plum did it with a tire iron in the library or something like that. So any instrument of iron so that he die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. So if you go at somebody and they're unaware, remember they have to be unaware, and you hit them with something made of iron, you intend to kill that person is what this is about. And so you're going to see through here that the intent is there to take this person's life. Okay? And that's what makes this murder. Murder is the intent to kill. And then it says in verse 17, if he smite him with throwing a stone wherewith he may die, and he die, he is a murderer. So wherewith he may die. Why is he throwing the stone? So that he dies. Wherewith he may die. Okay, so if you throw a stone at somebody with the intent to kill them, and they die, you are a murderer. And the murderer shall surely be put to death. So these guys are not, the cities of refuge do not apply to them. They can flee to those cities and they're still going to be avenged because of the manner of the death. And then you see in verse 18, or if you smite him with a hand weapon of wood. So maybe you've got a weapon of wood. They had like really strong sticks that they would use, like staves, or maybe wooden hatchets or something along those lines. Any weapon of wood, if it's meant to be a weapon, wherewith he may die. Now that's that phrase, so that he die, wherewith he may die, wherewith he may die. You're striking at them with intent to kill. If you do that and they die, you are a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And then it says, the revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. So this is probably going to be a kinsman or somebody that is related in some way to the victim. They are a revenger of blood. They are seeking eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that kind of thing. So the revenger of blood is the one that will actually slay the murderer. So maybe some other people catch this guy, this murderer's gotten away, and he gets caught. Nobody else has the authority to take the life of the murderer. They have to hold him, bind him, and wait for the revenger of blood, the person that is appointed to this task, and that is the person that's going to kill the murderer. Notice here, the revenger of blood shall slay, that is, kill the murderer. God is authorizing the taking of a life. So if we go back to Exodus 20 and verse 13 in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, has to be within the context of murder. Murder is what's being condemned. Murder is what's being spoken about here. And this person is guilty and is going to be put to death. That's what the law says. So all these people, you can't kill, you can't kill. It's a specific kind of killing. You have to use the context of the whole Bible. You cannot just look at one passage, one verse, and say, ooh, it says thou shalt not kill in the King James, and so you can't kill anybody. There's a lot of people who read that. Number one, we're not under the Old Testament anymore. So we can't look to the Old Testament for our laws anyway. But the idea of killing another person with intent, with maliciousness, this idea of hatred, what we call premeditated murder these days, the legal term. The idea is brought forward into the New Testament, but in the New Testament it's called murder. It's specifically referred to as murder. So use that context, understand that context, because God says if a person is a murderer, kill them. And you still aren't about, that's perfectly legal, perfectly just, perfectly moral, and you're not violating one of the Ten Commandments by doing that. Okay? So, the revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer. When he meets him, he shall slay him. So it carried out immediately. You don't wait. You come to meet him, do it, kill him. But if he thrust him of hatred or hurl at him by laying of wait that he die, or in enmity smite him with his hand that he die, he that smote him shall surely be put to death, for he is a murderer. Okay, so that's just giving you more definition of it. But if you try to kill somebody, like you thrust him of hatred, that's running him through with the sword, or hurl at him, that's the throwing of the stone, by laying in wait that he die, or enmity smite him with his hand that he die. The idea here is that you're killing somebody, premeditated, hatred, lying in wait, that all of this is what we define as murder today. So our definition of murder is not new. It's been around since Cain and Abel. I mean, isn't that what Cain did to Abel? He was mad. He was angry. He hated his brother and slew him out of jealousy. It's premeditated. So this is not a new thing. So this is all within the law. So verse 21 again, or in enmity smite him with his hand that he die. He that smote him shall surely be put to death. So if you kill somebody under these conditions, you're a murderer. You shall surely be put to death, for you are a murderer. The revenger of blood shall slay the murderer when he meets him. And then he says, God giving these conditions or these instructions to Moses, gives, okay, but that's a murderer, but what about these other kinds of death? This is what the cities of refuge were for. But if he thrust him suddenly without enmity, maybe they're practicing with swords or something, or maybe there's an accident where you didn't see, you turned around and somebody gets run through, or maybe you are clearing out a field and you're throwing rocks out of the field and you accidentally hit somebody, a thousand different scenarios where somebody might accidentally die because of what you're doing. They weren't paying attention, you weren't paying attention, and somebody ends up dead. Okay, so you thrust him suddenly without enmity, or have cast upon him anything without laying of wait. See, there's no premeditation here. You're not angry. You don't hate the guy. There's nothing here. Or with any stone wherewith a man may die, seeing him not. See, you don't even see the guy. And you cast it upon him that he die, and was not his enemy, neither sought his harm. Again, premeditated. So if none of that's true, then the congregation shall judge between the slayer and the revenger of blood according to these judgments. Okay, so that's what the congregation is supposed to ask these questions. And there's a lot of specifics that come out of this. There, you had to have multiple witnesses that could corroborate. Yeah, he hated him. He was talking bad about him. He was claiming he wanted to kill him or that kind of thing. You had to have 2 or 3 witnesses. You couldn't do it with one witness. Okay, and we'll get to that here in just a second. So verse 25, and the congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge. So he makes it to the city of refuge. They have the trial. They determine that the guy is innocent. The guy has to go back to the city of refuge, and he has to live there. He has to stay there, whether he was fled, and he shall abide in it until the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil. So, if you flee to one of these cities of refuge, you had to stay there, even if you were acquitted. If the congregation or if the Sanhedrin Council or whatever they called it said that you were innocent, you still had to stay in the city of refuge until the high priest, whoever the high priest happens to be when the judgment is handed down, until he dies. Now, that seems kind of odd, but if you understand back in Leviticus, the way that the high priest took on himself the sins kind of in a stand-in type of place. Remember, the Levites all stood in for the firstborn of all the other tribes, and the high priest had to go in on the Day of Atonement and atone for himself first, and then for the rest of the congregation. You have to understand that this idea of uncleanness goes with that high priest. And so this guy has to stay here, and that's all connected to this Day of Atonement and all of the sacrifices and whatever. So that high priest had to die before you could leave that city. So that's where you lived. You got a job there, you found a place to live, you worked there, and you stayed in that city until the high priest died. And part of this was to let the revenger of blood, you killed a family member, they're wanting to slay you. To eye for eye, tooth for tooth. They want that vengeance. And it's to give them time to mourn, to get over it, to cool down or whatever, because you're innocent. They should not be trying to kill you, but those emotions can run high. And so God is providing safety for the person who accidentally did the killing and for the revenger of blood. And so he's setting out some parameters here. Now, pay attention. But if the slayer, that's the guy that killed the other guy accidentally and got acquitted, if the slayer shall come at any time within the border or without the border, in other words, he leaves the city, without the border of the city of his refuge, whither he was fled, and the revenger of blood find him outside of the borders of the city of his refuge, and the revenger of blood kill the slayer, now does it say he must? It says if he does, then the revenger shall not be guilty of blood, because you still have taken a life. That's the way that this justice system worked. And it taught people to respect life. It taught them to be careful, to be aware of what was going on around them. It taught them the importance of blood. And like I said, it protected the slayer, the person who committed what we would call manslaughter. If you're driving your car and you're drunk, you're not intending to kill somebody, but you ended up killing somebody because you were drunk, didn't have control over the vehicle, or accidental discharge of a firearm and you end up killing somebody. You've killed somebody, but you didn't intend to. There was no murder or malice or anything like that. You still may end up, through your negligence or through whatever, paying for that. Even our own justice system is built on that idea. And so here, a little bit harsher time, God says that if you leave the city of refuge before the high priest is killed, or not killed, but before the high priest dies, and you happen to run into the revenger of blood, and he kills you, he's hunting you down and he kills you, still seeking that vengeance, then the avenger is not guilty of that blood. He's not guilty of murder at that time because he's still serving out justice. What balance is here that we see in not necessarily the New Testament, but in God's perspective of things. God is a just God. He seeks justice at all times. But his justice is in perfect harmony with his mercy and his love and his grace. So all of the aspects of God are in harmony. Is it just under the law of Moses that if you killed somebody, if you took their life, that your life is forfeit? Yes, that is justice. And so the revenger has the authority, while the high priest lives, to take your life. That is justice. But God offers mercy. He offers refuge within the cities. Think about that. What is the city of God in the New Testament? It's the New Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. Where do we find our refuge for the things that we have done wrong? In Christ, in the city of refuge, in the church. And so you can't just read these and say, okay, there's the law, that's what it is. You really need to look at these things and you need to say, okay, what is this pointing to? How does this help us learn about God? How does this help us learn about what's to come in terms of the church and Christ and those types of things? And that's what this is pointing to. Those cities of refuge are typifying the church, typifying the bride of Christ, the city of the heavenly Jerusalem. And they are in balance with God's justice. Does God, if you are outside of the city of refuge, and God, who is the avenger, finds you outside of the city, in his justice, is he just for killing you, for sending you to Gehenna? Absolutely. If you go into the city of refuge, are you safe until the high priest dies? Absolutely. Thing is, our high priest doesn't ever die. And so as long as you abide in that city, you will remain alive. But if you leave the city, if you leave the church, sorry, once saved, always saved people. If you knew your anti-type relationships, you know that your eternal security doctrine is false. If you leave the city of refuge, if you leave the church, you willfully turn your back on God before the high priest dies, because Jesus doesn't ever die and he is our high priest. If you leave the church and you die, God is just to send you to Gehenna. I mean, that's the understanding that I get out of this. That's the lesson of this law that we see here. All right, what does it say? Verse 28, because he should have remained in the city of his refuge until the death of the high priest. The revenger is not guilty of the blood because he should have remained in the city of his refuge. What should we do? We should remain in the city. We should remain in the church of Christ. We should continue to walk in the light. And our high priest doesn't ever die, so we got to stay in the city. It's just that simple. But after the death of the high priest, the slayer shall return into the land of his possession, because the land promises bringing in Messiah, all those kinds of things. And after the death of the high priest, the avenger of blood, or the revenger of blood, no longer has the authority to take that guy's life, because his manslaughter, his wrongdoing, even though it wasn't murder, goes with the high priest into death. And so this guy gets to return to the land of his possession. Now, if he dies before the high priest dies, then his land will pass on to a son or a family member or whatever to maintain the land promise. But that's what's going to happen. And then it says in verse 29, so these things shall be for a statute of judgment unto you throughout your generations and all your dwellings. So how long was this going to last? throughout your generations, as long as the children of Israel lived, in all of your dwellings. So as long as they kept the promised land. All right. Whoso killeth any person, a murderer, shall be put to death by the mouth of witnesses. So now we're going to get into the idea of witnesses here. So notice that it's plural, the mouth of witnesses. But one witness shall not testify against any person to cause him to die. So if there's a trial and the potential verdict would render the death penalty, then you need more than one witness. Now, you can have a witness to a lesser outcome. You could have a single witness for like a minor infraction or something like that. But here it's specifically saying one witness is insufficient for the death penalty. Moreover, you shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer, which is guilty of death. In other words, if that person is a murderer, the person that has murdered somebody and they die, you should take no satisfaction. You should not. Justice is done, and that's it. And it's teaching us a little bit about God here. God does not take pleasure. He is not satisfied. He is not feeling good when he has to dispense justice to those who rebel against him. And he's teaching us about himself in this, because what does God say? Vengeance is mine, I will repay, thus saith the Lord. Who is the revenger of blood? It's God. God is the ultimate revenger of blood, and he takes no satisfaction in dispensing his justice. It in fact saddens him, and it should sadden us when somebody is executed for murder under our own justice system. We don't look at that person and be happy that they got their comeuppance, that they got justice was served, and I'm going to throw a party. I'm super excited. No, you're sad because the life of another person had to be taken. Justice is served, so be it, and that's the end of it. And if we take satisfaction in the taking of another life, aren't we becoming like the person that we are hating? Aren't we becoming like the person who took the life of our loved one? Aren't we feeling the same emotions that they felt if they committed a murder? And so God is being very specific here. Don't take satisfaction in the life of a murderer. Verse 32, and you shall take no satisfaction for him that is fled to the city of his refuge, that he should come again to dwell on the land until the death of the priest. In other words, if a person kills one of your relatives and he has to flee into the city and he's acquitted, you don't say, haha, at least he has to stay in the city of refuge until the priest dies. There's no satisfaction in that. It's just justice. It's just what God calls for. What does God's justice call for us? When we sin, we are worthy of death. We flee to the city of refuge, that is the New Jerusalem. We obey the gospel. We are added to the church. We are now in the city of refuge. God doesn't say, ha ha ha, you have to stay in the church. He's not laughing at us, or he's not feeling satisfaction that we had to rely on his son who had to die for our sins. There's no joy in that in a personal kind of vindictive manner. But what there is joy that justice is done, that a soul is saved, that a person has turned to God for mercy and for grace, and that person is going to be adopted into the family of God. That's where the joy is, in the righteousness and the salvation. Not that a person is stuck or somehow having to be missing out on something. God is not joyful in that vindictive sense. in the way that a revenger of blood might be, or a family member might be, seeing that somebody who has committed this crime is getting justice. And so we should be careful about that even today. When justice is being served, we need to be looking towards rehabilitation of criminals. We need to be looking for justice being served, but without the pleasure in it. There should be no pleasure in serving justice. It's a thing that has to be done. And I'm not going to say necessary evil, because there's no such thing as necessary evil. But I will say that this is the way to approach justice. Justice is a necessary thing that we take no joy in. And I think that's the proper approach, and I think this is a great lesson for Numbers 35 for any time. You can take a look at it. Remember Romans 15:4. These things were written for our learning. So, all right. Finishing up here, there's the last little bit here about the blood itself. It says, "So you shall not pollute the land wherein you are, for blood it defiles the land. And the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it." Okay, so if somebody commits a murder, and somebody other than the revenger of blood kills them, trying to serve justice or whatever, it pollutes the land. It was considered an uncleanness that couldn't be taken out of the land. Well, what do we see in Matthew 23? What does Jesus say of the Pharisees and the scribes and the people? You are guilty of the blood, all the way from Abel, all the way up to the prophet. I forget his name. I think it's like Barachias or something like that they slew between the altar and the temple. And he says, you're guilty of all that blood, because so much life, so much blood was shed in an unjust manner, and you can't cleanse it from the land unless it be by the revenger. Okay? For blood defiles the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it. Okay? And the only way to do that is if the avenger comes in and takes his life justly, serving the law, serving the justice. What did Jesus do? Jesus, as the avenger, actually came in and took our place and cleansed the murder, cleansed the sin, cleansed the land in the sense of the Jews. All the things that he did in fulfilling the law were the culmination of these things in the perfect sense, because none of the Jews would have done this in a perfect sense besides him. And so it's just an interesting look at the idea of cleanliness and blood and how all that worked out. But anyway, verse 34, defile not therefore the land which you shall inhabit, wherein I dwell. So God is there, and God can't stand sin. So he says, don't defile the land, for I, Jehovah, dwell among the children of Israel. So don't go around committing murder. Don't go around seeking justice out of hand. Don't be the revenger when it's not your place. 2 or 3 witnesses if somebody has to die. All of these things are culminating in the idea of God is dwelling with them. You don't need to be a slaughter machine. God doesn't like the taking of life, but he understands that in cases it is necessary. Again, not a necessary evil, but it is necessary. Okay, so that's chapter 35. I am going to tack on 36 here at the end because it's fairly short and pretty easy to understand, but this is the last chapter of the book of Numbers. So chapter 36 and verse 1. And the chief fathers of the families of the children of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, of the families of the sons of Joseph, came near and spake before Moses and before the princes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel. Okay, so there was a problem earlier on when they had been wandering in the wilderness for a while, and then the daughters of Zelophehad came and said, our dad died in the wilderness of his own sin. He wasn't part of Korah's rebellion. but he didn't have any sons. And so is our father's name, his family, are we just not going to get an inheritance? And so Moses said, nope. Or God through Moses said, nope. Daughters, if a man only has daughters, then they can get the inheritance. Well, these guys are coming along and saying, well, what if these daughters marry somebody from another tribe? What happens to the land? Does it pass to another tribe? And that would have gotten pretty crazy. And I've read at several places where there were traditions that kind of overcame the law, but 36 actually deals with it and says this is what God wants you to do. Anyway, let's read what this is, and we'll talk about those traditions that kind of made the law of God null and void. It says, they said, Jehovah commanded my Lord, talking about Moses, to give the land for an inheritance by lot to the children of Israel. And my Lord, again Moses, was commanded by Jehovah to give the inheritance of Zelophehad, our brother, unto his daughters. Okay, because Zelophehad had died, and so his daughters didn't have any sons or whatever, so he got the daughters. And then they said, if they be married to any of the sons of the other tribes of the children of Israel, then shall their inheritance be taken from the inheritance of our fathers. Okay, so they would, since Zelophehad was of the tribe of Manasseh, all the way down through Machir and Gilead, and they said, if they married into another tribe, then what should have been part of Manasseh is going to be given to another tribe. And they were worried about that. And so it says, and it shall be put into the inheritance of the tribe whereunto they are received, so shall it be taken from the lot of our inheritance. And it was an odd way for land that should have stayed within the tribe of Manasseh to pass to the ownership of another tribe. And that is not what God promised them. And then it says, and when the Jubilee of the children of Israel shall be, then shall their inheritance be put unto the inheritance of the tribe whereunto they are received. So even at Jubilee, it wouldn't revert back to Manasseh. It would stay within the new tribe. And so you know, hypothetically, you could whittle away all the land of a single tribe to where there was nothing left because it had been dispersed amongst all the other tribes because of a bunch of daughters intermarrying with other tribes. So shall their inheritance be taken away from the inheritance of the tribe of our fathers. All right, it was very important. The land promise stayed with whatever tribe they were a part of. They weren't, because of God's promises, they were supposed to stay. If you were of the tribe of Manasseh, that should have stayed not just with the tribe of Manasseh, but whatever family entered into the promised land. So let's say there was the Smiths. The Smiths were a large family that entered in. You had the elder, the oldest of the Smith family, or the head of the Smith family, as they went in and they conquered. Then the Smiths got their portion based on how many people they had in their family. Well, forevermore, that particular land belonged to the Smith lineage. Well, if, down the road, let's say 10 acres of that ended up going to some daughters because there were no sons, and then those daughters married into another tribe, that 10 acres now become part of the land of that other tribe. And it gets removed from the promise to the Smith tribe, or the Smith sub-tribe. And that would break God's promise. And so these guys are rightly bringing up an objection or a conflict or an issue. And so Moses commanded the children of Israel, according to the word of Jehovah, saying, the tribe of the sons of Joseph have said, well, this is the thing which Jehovah does command concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, let them marry to whom they think best, only to the family of the tribe of their father shall they marry. Okay, fixes the problem. Daughters, if your dad had no sons, if you want to get that land inheritance that belongs to you, to keep it in the family, the only way that you get to keep that land is if you marry within that tribal thing. So you have to marry a Smith. Now, keep in mind, Leviticus 18, you can't marry a close relative. Can't marry a brother or sister, can't marry a father or a mother, can't marry an aunt or an uncle or a first cousin, and that was it. But you could still marry second, third, generations down the road, fifth cousin or whatever, part of the Smith sub-tribe, as it had expanded out and gone down through generations. You have enough of a dilution there that you're not violating Leviticus 18, but you still have to marry within the family. And that would keep the land promise. And again, this goes back to the idea of, who did Cain marry? He married his sister. We think today, ew, but back then, with the protection of the ice canopy, with the strength of the genetic code, the man had not degraded genetically, perfectly fine, no problems. All the way up to Abraham, who marries his half-sister, not a problem. God, in his foresight, says, okay, Leviticus 18, you can't marry a close relative, before it actually becomes a problem. But still, marrying within, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, or whatever, isn't a problem at this time, because, again, human genetics hasn't degraded enough. When is it a problem? Hundreds and hundreds of years down the road now. So we don't want to marry second cousins, third cousins, people that are still fairly closely related to us because of, I hope his hair right there, because of the genetic problems that it produces. And so you just want to find somebody fairly far away from you genetically. 6, 7, 10 generations away from you. Across the world. Great. All right. And so he says, let them marry whom they think best, only to the family of the tribe of their father shall they remarry. So shall not the inheritance of the children of Israel remove from tribe to tribe, for every one of the children of Israel shall keep himself to the inheritance of the tribe of his fathers. Okay, fixes the problem. They get to keep it within the inheritance stays within the family. And every daughter that possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the children of Israel shall be wife unto one of the family of the tribe of her father, that the children of Israel may enjoy every man the inheritance of his fathers. Okay, so they get to keep what God promised them. Neither shall the inheritance remove from one tribe to another tribe. So that was just a flat out no. There's no way under God's law that a land that was given to a particular tribe could go to another tribe. It's not possible under the law. So however else the law has, and see, these are the Zelophehad thing with his daughters was an interpretation of the original law. This right here with the tribe of Manasseh bringing up the objection about Zelophehad's daughters marrying is an interpretation of this. And so God is setting precedent here of, okay, I'm giving you the law about how the land and the inheritance is supposed to work. Now I'm going to give you some examples of how to interpret the law so that, verse 9, the inheritance can't remove from one tribe to another. And so what he's saying here is basically you interpret the law in such a way that the land inheritance never goes from tribe to tribe. You cannot cross tribal boundaries. And I think it gives a good specific example, and it gives a good generalization of the rule or the reason behind the law. And I think it's not just good in the sense of understanding the land laws and whatever the inheritance of the Israelites, but I also see this as a good teaching tool for interpreting Scripture, just straight up. When we get into the New Testament, we're given commands, we're given examples, and then we have to draw our own conclusions, just like they do here. God says, here's the law. The land is going to be given to particular tribes, and you can't move land from one tribe to another. And then he says, you have to interpret that, whatever scenarios come up, you have to interpret that law or that scenario within this law. And let me give you a couple of examples. Zelophehad's daughters, if a guy doesn't have any sons, they get the daughters get it, but the daughters can't marry into another tribe if that's the case. And so we've got examples. We see this in the New Testament. What does God command us to do? He gives us a command to partake of the Lord's Supper, right? Then he gives us some examples that show how the Lord's Supper is to be partaken of. Of course, 1 Corinthians 11 tells us what we're supposed to do, partaking of the unleavened bread, the fruit of the vine. But then we also see that the reason that they meet was to partake of the Lord's Supper there in 1 Corinthians 11. Well, then we infer from 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, that when they were meeting on the first day of the week, why were they meeting? To partake of the Lord's Supper. When were they meeting? Every first day of the week. When they were doing that, they were also supposed to give of their means. And so there's a drawing of a conclusion there. And then we have a specific example in Acts chapter 20, where Paul is in a hurry to get to Jerusalem, but he stops and waits in Troas for 6 days so that on the first day of the week, he can partake of the Lord's Supper with them. He doesn't arrive on a Sunday, he arrives on a Monday, and he waits so that he can partake of the Lord's Supper. If he can take the Lord's Supper any day of the week, why would he wait? But he waits so that he can partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. So we have the command to partake of the Lord's Supper. We have the specific example in Acts chapter 20, and we have the necessary inference or the interpretation of when that command was supposed to be carried out in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And it's a logical way to interpret the scripture, and I think that this is consistent throughout the Bible. It's not just in one place. It's not just a Church of Christ thing. I think the Bible tells us how to interpret itself, and this is one of those examples. Okay? Verse 10. Even as Jehovah commanded Moses, so did the daughters of Zelophehad. For Mahlah, Tirzah, and Hoglah, and Milcah, and Noah, the daughters of Zelophehad, were married unto their father's brothers' sons. Now, understand here, that's not saying they married their first cousins. This is talking about the fathers is ancestors. We would use the word ancestors like a grandfather, great-grandfather, something along those lines. So somebody up, but their father's relatives, and the word sons here can also mean like far cousins. So verse 11 does not teach that they violated Leviticus 18 by marrying a near relative. But the way that fathers, brothers, sons can be interpreted under the Hebrew, it can spread further out than first cousins. Just understand that. This is not a contradiction. This is not these ladies violating the law to keep the law. That's not what they were doing. And that's not what God commanded them. There's no contradiction in the Bible. Okay, so it says, and they were married into the families of the sons of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. So there it is. There's the broad understanding of this. That wasn't specifically their first cousins, but they were married into the families of the sons of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained in the tribe of the family of their father. And this was going to be applied for 1,500 years. These are the commandments and the judgments which Jehovah commanded by the hand of Moses unto the children of Israel in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. So when did Moses write the book of Numbers? In the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. He's summing up. This is the book that I wrote. We call it the book of Numbers today, and that became its name early on. But this parchment, this book, this set of rules, and this record of what happened, all of this was written after the fact in the plains of Moab by Jordan near Jericho. And then we're going to see one more writing, which we call the Book of Deuteronomy, written to a more mature Israel than what Leviticus was written to. And then we're going to see the Book of Deuteronomy, and at the very end of it, it records the death of Moses. And so we know that Joshua finishes up the writing of the Book of Deuteronomy there before they march in, because Moses doesn't get to go. Moses does not get to cross the Jordan. And so Joshua is the one that wraps up the book of Deuteronomy. Again, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he carries the mantle of shepherd for the flock, for the nation of Israel, as they march into battle into the land of Canaan. Thank you for joining me for the book of Numbers. I really appreciate your time and journeying with me through this book. I hope that going through this book this way has brought it to life for you, has made it something more interesting to study, something that was not boring, as sometimes we might find it if we try to study it only on the surface and we don't really try to dig and understand what these things mean and how they pertain not to us specifically, but how they point to us, how they point to the first century, how they point to Christ, how they point to the church. And understanding those things and learning these lessons really, I think, brings the book of Numbers and all of these first 5 books, which can really be difficult to go through if you don't have the right mindset. But I hope that I've been able to bring it to life for you a little bit, and that maybe you have an interest now in going back and studying for yourself. Maybe you'll find out some things that I didn't present here, or maybe that I don't even know. And if you do, then please let me know. Comment in the comment section of whatever chapter you find out something in, and let's discuss it. I love learning new things, especially about the Bible, and would love to have your feedback. So again, thank you for watching, and look forward to studying the book of Deuteronomy with you.